Hi, I'll be going over Leetcode number 200, which is also called number of islands. The problem statement is that given a 2D grid map of ones, land, and zeros, water, count the number of islands. An island is surrounded by water and is formed by connecting adjacent lands horizontally or vertically. You may assume all four edges of the grid are all surrounded by water. So let's look at the first example. So we're given this grid as an input, and again the ones represent land and the zeros represent water. So here we can see that there is just one island because all of the ones are connected to each other adjacently, either horizontally or vertically. So the output would be 1. In example number 2, we have one island over here, we have an island here, and we also have one more island on the bottom right corner. And so the output would be 3 because there are 3 islands. So let's go over the approach to this problem. So first of all, this is a pretty standard DFS/BFS problem. And the idea behind the solution is basically we're going to iterate through the grid. And whenever we encounter an island, we will add 1 to the number of islands, and we will remove that island by setting all of the ones in the island to be 0. So going through all of the elements in an island, we can do that with either BFS or DFS. So I'll go over the DFS code. And again, we need to do the following. First, we iterate through the elements of the grid. Then whenever we encounter a 1, which is the start of an island, we DFS. And then when we DFS, we need to check for 3 things. First, we need to make sure the current element is in bounds and is 1. Second, we need to set the element to 0 because again, we're removing the island. So we want to set it to 0, which represents water. And then third, we're going to recurse in all 4 directions. Okay, so let's start coding this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create 2 variables that represent the number of rows and columns inside the grid. And then we're also going to create a variable that represents the number of islands. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is iterate through all of the elements in the grid. And we know that whenever we encounter a 1, which is the start of an island, we want a DFS. So if grid of I of j is equal to 1, then we DFS. And in the DFS, we need to know the position of the current element. So we need to know the x and y coordinates. And then we would also need to have the grid. So we need 3 pieces of information for our DFS, which I already included correspondingly over here. Okay, and then also we know that we should increase the number of islands by 1. So let me add that in there. Okay, so now let's move on to the DFS code. So again, we're taking in the x and the y coordinate of the current element, and we're also taking in the grid. So inside the DFS, we know that we want to first make sure the current element is in bounds and is equal to 1. So let me first copy the number of rows and columns variables. Okay, so if out of bounds or not 1, we want to return. So if a is less than 0 or b is less than 0, or a is greater than or equal to x, or b is greater than or equal to y, or a grid of a of b is not equal to 1, we return. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set the current element to 0, because again, we're trying to remove the island, so we want to turn it into water. So we would just do grid of a of b is equal to 0. And the last thing we're going to do is we want to recurse in all 4 directions. And in order to do this, I'm going to create 2 arrays to represent the 4 directions you would recurse in for the x coordinate and the y coordinate. So the changes in x would be -1, 1, 0, and 0. And the changes in y would be 0, 0, -1, and 1. And then we can just do a for loop that goes over all 4 elements. And so we would do DFS of a plus change x of I and b plus change y of I, and then we would also have the grid. Okay, so the last thing we want to do is we want to return the number of islands at the end of this function. So let me write that. And then we also know if our grid is empty, then we want to automatically return 0. Okay, so let's try running this code. Okay, so we get that it's accepted, so let's try submitting. And we get that it works.